Caleb Wright thought he had no one left in the world. His father was gone, his home was slipping away, and the men in power saw him as nothing more than a signature on a piece of paper. Then Silas Montgomery appeared, a scarred, grieving cowboy who had spent years running from his own ghosts. Neither of them knew that their lives were already connected by an old battlefield, a forgotten act of mercy, and a debt of love that time had never erased. What began as pity soon became something much deeper, the birth of a family not made by blood, but by choice.
Dodge City didn't sleep. It just blinked, usually with a bloodshot eye. It was April 1878, springtime on the plains. The air tasted of prairie dust and cattle. 100,000 head of Texas longhorns were coming up the Chisholm Trail. The town was loud with it, pianos banging, men shouting, horses stamping in the mud. Silas Montgomery rode in from the south. He was 38, looked older, 6'2" of tired old bone and quiet muscle. A jagged bayonet scar ran down his left jaw. A souvenir from a war most folks were trying hard to forget. He carried a Winchester in his scabbard, a Colt on his hip. But he rode like a man who hoped he never have to touch either of them again. He didn't come looking for a home. He came looking for a bed. He found Kensington S. Rest at the quiet end of 2nd Avenue. Clean windows, a swept porch. Silas tied his roan to the hitching post. Pushed through the heavy oak doors. Martha Kensington was behind the counter. 30-something, eyes that missed nothing, hands that knew hard work. "Need a room," Silas said, voice like gravel on a tin roof. "Got one," she said. $50 a night, no boots on the quilt. Silas put 3 silver coins on the wood. A week. Martha took the money, looked at him, really looked. She'd seen 100 drifters, but she saw the heavy way he stood, like he was carrying something you couldn't see. "Room 4. Top of the stairs," she said. Silas nodded, left his gear, walked back out into the noise. He needed a meal, needed to stretch his legs. He walked down the boardwalk. The Alhambra saloon was roaring. Silas kept walking. The noise faded a bit as he hit the edge of town. That was when he saw the building. Faded white paint, a wooden sign above the door, Dodge City Children's Home. And on the bottom step, there was a boy, 7 years old, maybe, sitting dead straight, knees pulled tight to his chest, not crying, just watching the street. He wore a cotton shirt, 2 sizes too big. But what caught Silas's eye was the belt, a thick leather strap, and hanging from it, a small, heavy blacksmith-esque hammer. Stopped. He didn't want to. He was a man who minded his own business. But something about that rigid little spine made his boots plant in the dirt. He walked over, stopped at the bottom of the steps. The boy didn't flinch, just looked up. Clear eyes, stubborn chin. "You lost, son?" Silas asked. The boy held his gaze. "I'm not lost, sir. I live here." "That's so?" "Yes, sir, but I'm just waiting." "Waiting for what?" The boy's hands gripped his knees tighter. The knuckles went white. "For someone to come, say there's been a mistake." Silas felt a cold knot pull tight in his stomach. He recognized that look. It was the look of someone trying to hold the world together by sheer willpower. He looked at the little iron hammer. "Your pa Smith?" Silas asked. The boy touched the head of the hammer. "He was. He made this for me." Silas took a slow breath. He had spent 6 years running from ghosts. 6 years avoiding anyone who could make him feel anything. But looking at this boy, he knew he couldn't just walk away, not without saying what needed to be said. Silas slowly lowered himself. He bent one knee into the Dodge City dust. He brought himself right down to the boy's eye level. He didn't look down at him. He looked across at him. "Listen to me," Silas said. His voice was low, steady. "A person's worth isn't measured by who left them behind, or where they end up sitting. You hear me? Every human being, no matter how small they are, deserves to be treated with respect. They deserve the truth, not pity. The boy blinked just once. You're a person, Silas told him, pointing a thick, scarred finger at the boy's chest. You have rights. The right to be spoken to honest. The right to be looked in the eye. Don't let anyone in this town treat you like you're less than a man just because you're a child. The boy let go of his knees. He sat a little taller. The tension in his small shoulders dropped just a fraction. My name is Caleb, he said. Caleb Wright. I'm Silas. He touched the brim of his hat. You remember what I said? Caleb Wright. Silas stood up. He turned, walked back toward the center of town. That night, in room 4, Silas sat on the edge of the bed. The room was quiet. The town outside wasn't. He poured a glass of whiskey, held it up to the warm lamplight. He closed his eyes, saw his wife, saw his little girl. The fever, the fresh dirt on the graves, the running, the endless, empty miles of running. He opened his eyes, and all he saw was a 7-year-old boy, holding a hammer, waiting for a mistake to be fixed. Silas walked over to the wash basin. He tipped the glass. The whiskey hit the porcelain, washed down the drain. He didn't know the boy. He didn't owe him a thing. But as Silas laid his head on the pillow, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't running tomorrow. The sun came up hot, baked the mud dry. Dodge City woke with a hangover and a bad temper. Silas Montgomery didn't mind. He was used to bad tempers. He needed work. A room at Kensington S Rest cost $50. Meals cost another. A man S Pride cost more if he had to beg. Silas didn't beg. He rode out to the edge of town. Found the ranch office for Jedediah Thorne. Thorne was a big man, wore a tailored suit that's cost more than a cowboy made in 2 years. His boots were polished. His hands were clean. He smelled of bay rum and expensive cigars. He smiled a lot. Silas didn't trust him. Men with clean hands in a dirty world usually paid someone else to do their bleeding. I need a man to count head on the eastern ridge, Thorne said, voice smooth as buttered rum. 35 a month. You look like a man who can count, Montgomery. I can count, Silas said. Good. Start today. Silas rode the ridge, counted cattle. 300 head of red-brown steers. Dust in his teeth. Sweat on his back. It was simple work. Honest work? The kind that kept a man's mind quiet. But his mind wouldn't stay quiet. It kept drifting back to a boy with a hammer. By mid-afternoon, Silas rode back into Dodge. He tied his horse, walked down the boardwalk to buy some tobacco. His boots echoed on the wood. He passed the children's home. He stopped. There was a scuffle in the dirt yard. 3 older boys, maybe 10, 11 years old. They had Caleb backed against the wooden fence. The biggest one was laughing. He held a small, iron blacksmith-esque hammer just out of Caleb's reach. Give it back, Caleb said. His voice didn't shake. Not a bit. Or what, Orphan? The big boy sneered. Your daddy gonna come make me. Oh, wait. He's dead. Silas unhooked the leather strap on his horse just a bit. He stepped off the boardwalk. But before Silas could open the gate, Caleb moved. The boy didn't yell, didn't cry. He stepped forward, planted his small boots in the dirt, and drove his fist straight into the big boy's nose. There was a sharp crack. The big boy dropped the hammer, grabbed his bleeding face, started screaming. The other 2 backed away, eyes wide. Caleb bent down, picked up his hammer, wiped the dust off the iron head, hooked it back onto his belt. Silas opened the gate. The hinges squeaked. The boys froze. Silas walked over. He looked at the big boy, who was sobbing into his hands. Then he looked down at Caleb. Caleb's knuckles were red. His chest was heaving, but his eyes were dry as a bone. That was a clean hit, Silas said quietly, but it was a stupid one. He's twice your size. My pa told me size don't matter if you're right, Caleb said. Silas almost smiled. Almost. Your pa was a brave man, But brave men end up in the ground just the same as cowards. Come on. Silas didn't wait. He turned and walked out the gate. He didn't check to see if Caleb followed. He just knew he would. They walked to the general store. Silas bought a heavy square of yellow cornbread wrapped in paper. He walked to the edge of town, where the buildings stopped and the prairie started. He sat on a wooden crate. Caleb sat on the ground beside him. Silas broke the cornbread in half, handed a piece to the boy. They ate in silence. The wind chewed at the dry grass. It was a good silence, not the heavy kind, just the quiet between two people who didn't feel the need to fill the air with useless words. When the bread was gone, Caleb wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. You got a family, Mr. Silas? Silas went still. He looked out at the horizon. The sky was huge out here, big enough to swallow a man whole. Had one, Silas said. What happened? Sickness, cholera, took them both. Caleb nodded, slowly, like a man, not a boy. My pa died too. Fever took him 6 months ago. The boy looked down at his boots. His hand rested on the hammer. He swallowed hard. Mr. Silas? Yeah, does the hurting ever stop? Silas looked at the boy. He could have lied. It would have been easy. Adults lie to kids all the time. They think it protects them. It doesn't. It just makes them feel crazy when the world hurts anyway. Silas leaned forward. He rested his elbows on his knees. Listen to me, Caleb, and remember it, Silas said. His voice was firm. People are going to tell you that time heals all wounds. They're going to tell you that if you just wait long enough, you'll forget the pain. That's a lie. Caleb looked up. His eyes were wide. The hurting doesn't stop, Silas said. Grief isn't a sickness you cure. Grief is just love that ain't got nowhere to go. It sits heavy in your chest because it has to. But here is the lesson you need to learn. A real man doesn't run from that pain. A real man doesn't try to drown it or hide it. You learn to carry it. You build your shoulders up stronger so you can bear the weight. You carry that pain so you can stand up a little straight. That is how we honor the people we lost. We live a good life, a hard life, a true life, carrying them with us. Every single step. Caleb stared at him. The words settled over the boy. You could see it happen. The tight, defensive coil in Caleb's shoulders loosened. He took a deep, shaky breath. Stand up straighter, Caleb whispered. That's right, Silas said. Caleb! A sharp voice broke the quiet. Silas turned. A woman was hurrying toward them. She wore a gray dress, a tight bun, dust on her hem. Agnes Porter, the matron of the children's home. She looked tired, scared. Caleb, right, you come here this instant, she scolded, though there was no heat in it. Just worry. Caleb stood up. He looked at Silas. Thank you for the cornbread, sir. You're welcome, Caleb. The boy jogged over to the matron. She took his hand. Then she looked back at Silas. She told the boy to go wait by the gate. Caleb ran off. Agnes walked over to Silas. She wrung her hands together. Mr. Montgomery, she said. Ma'am, you seem like a decent man, but you need to stay away from that boy. Silas frowned. I bought him some bread. He was getting knocked around. I know, Agnes softly, and I thank you for that. But you're complicating things. The boy has a prospect, a good one. Papers are being drawn up right now with the county judge. Someone's adopting him? Silas asked. He felt a strange, sudden tightness in his chest. Who? Agnes looked around, lowered her voice. Mr. Jedediah Thorne. Silas stared at her. Thorne? Yes, he's a very prominent man. He can give Caleb a proper home. Schooling, a future. The judge is reviewing the petition at the end of the month. Agnes sighed, a weary sound. Caleb is a hard boy. He doesn't smile. He doesn't play. Most folks don't want a child with eyes that old. Mr. Thorne is a blessing. Don't go giving the boy ideas about cowboys in the trail. Mr. Montgomery, let him have his blessing." She turned and walked away. Silas sat on the crate. The wind kept blowing. Jedediah Thorne, a man with a 4,000-acre ranch, a man with polished boots and clean hands, a man who didn't look twice at a stray dog on the street. Why would a man like that want a 7-year-old orphan who refused to smile? Silas stood up. He didn't know the answer, but he knew the smell of rot when it drifted on the wind. And right now, the whole town of Dodge City stank of it. The next morning, Silas rode out early. Thorne had him riding the northeast boundary today, checking fence lines, pounding loose stakes back into the hard Kansas dirt. It was grueling work. The sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer. Silas took his coat off, sweated through his shirt. He swung a heavy wooden mallet, driving a cedar post deep into the ground. Whack! He thought about Caleb. Whack! He thought about Thorne. Whack! He wiped his brow with the back of a leather glove. He walked the line. He was at the far edge of Thorne's property, where the flat grass met a slight, rolling hill. There was a creek bed here, mostly dry. Beside it stood an old wooden boundary marker. It was weathered, gray from the sun and rain. Silas walked past it. Then he stopped. He backed up, looked closer. Someone had carved letters into the wood, deep, deliberate cuts. N.W. Wright, 1875. Silas took his hat off, ran a hand through his dark hair. Wright, Caleb Wright. He looked around. It was beautiful land. Access to the creek. Good grass. Perfect for grazing. Perfect for building a life. Silas mounted his horse. He didn't finish counting the cattle. He spurred the roan into a gallop, headed straight back to Dodge. He hitched his horse outside the county clerk's office, a square brick building. Smelled like old paper and stale ink. Silas walked in, dust on his boots, sweat on his shirt. The clerk was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses. He looked up, annoyed at the intrusion. "Help you?" the clerk asked. "Need to check a land claim," Silas said. "Under the Homestead Act. Name of N. Wright. Filed around 75. The clerk sighed, pulled down a heavy leather-bound ledger, flipped through the thick pages. Dust motes danced in the sunlight coming through the window. "Right. Right." The clerk ran his finger down a column. "Ah, here it is. Nathaniel Wright. Filed March 4th, 1875, 160 acres, northeast of town limits." "Is the claim still valid?" Silas asked. "The man died 6 months ago." The clerk adjusted his glasses. "Well, under the act, a man's got to work the land for 5 years to get the deed. Wright died before the 5 years was up. But the law says a legal heir can take over the claim and finish the time." "He has a son," Silas said. "Elijah?" "No, Caleb." "Yes, Caleb Wright is listed as the heir." The clerk flipped a page. "However, there is a dispute filed against the claim." Silas felt the blood go cold in his veins. "Filed by who?" "Jedediah Thorne Land Company," the clerk read. "Filed this past January, claiming the land was abandoned." Silas closed his eyes for a second. It all clicked into place. The pieces fit tight and ugly. If Caleb remained an orphan, the state would eventually take the land. Thorne would buy it for pennies. But Thorne didn't want to risk an auction. If Thorne became Caleb's legal guardian, Thorne would have immediate legal control over the boy's assets, including the land claim. Once Caleb turned 18, Thorne would force him to sign it over permanently. Or worse, Thorne would just sell it to his own company while Caleb was still a minor. Thorne wasn't adopting a son. He was stealing a farm. Silas walked out of the clerk's office. The bright sunlight hit him like a physical blow. He stood on the wooden boardwalk, watched the wagons roll by, watched the people of Dodge going about their business, oblivious to the quiet robbery happening in plain sight. He walked down to the Children's home. He didn't go to the gate. He walked around to the back alley. Looking over the low fence, Caleb was there, sitting alone under a scrub oak tree, drawing in the dirt with a stick. "Caleb," Silas called softly. The boy looked up, dropped the stick, ran over to the fence. "Mr. Silas, you're not supposed to be here. Mrs. Porter will be angry." "I won't stay long," Silas said. He looked over the fence down at the boy. "Your pa, Nathaniel. Did he talk to you about his land?" Caleb S.'s face changed. The guard came. The hard, stoic mask. Said we had a place. Out by the creek. Said we were going to build a house with a real glass window. Said I'd have a horse of my own. "You ever been out there?" Caleb shook his head. "Pot's sick before we could go." "Is it gone? Did they take it?" Silas looked at the boy, looked at the hammer on his hip. He thought about Thorn's polished boots. Silas leaned over the fence. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, Caleb. I'm wishing to teach you something about the world." Caleb stepped closer, listening hard. "There are men in this world who think they own everything," Silas said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "They think money gives them the right to walk over anybody smaller than them. They think the law is just a tool to protect their gold." Silas pointed a finger. "But they are wrong. The law wasn't written just to protect the rich, son. It was written to make all men stand at the exact same height. It was written to give a boy with a hammer the exact same weight in this world as a man with a bank account. A society only survives when the strong are bound by the same rules as the weak. Do you understand that?" Caleb nodded slowly. "Like a scale, it has to balance." "Exactly like a scale," Silas said. "Your father filed for that land legally. It belongs to you. And there is a man trying to steal it by pretending to be your family." Caleb's eyes widened. "Mr. Thorne, yes." Caleb gripped the fence. His knuckles turned white. "What do we do?" Silas heard that word. It hit him hard. "We fight," Silas said. "Not with our fists. That's what Thorne expects. We fight with the rules he thinks he owns." "How?" "I'll handle that," Silas said. "You just stay strong. Don't sign anything Thorne gives you. Don't agree to anything. You hear me?" "Yes, sir." Silas tipped his hat. He walked away. That night, Room 4 felt different. It didn't feel like a place to hide. It felt like a bunker. Silas lit the oil lamp on the small wooden desk. He opened his saddlebags, dug past the spare bullets, past the sharpening stone. He pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen. He hadn't touched a pen in years. Before the war, before the mud and the blood of Chickamauga, Silas Montgomery had been a student. He had spent a year at the University of Cincinnati, reading law, studying the intricate machinery of justice. The war had drafted him, broke his soul, made him a soldier. The cholera had taken his family, made him a ghost. He had spent 15 years pretending to be an uneducated drifter because it was easier to be nobody than to be somebody who had failed. Silas uncapped the pen. The metal nib caught the lamplight. He placed a fresh sheet of paper on the desk. His hand shook. A slight tremor. The soldier's heart. The lingering terror of the artillery shells. He took a breath. Thought of a 7-year-old boy trying not to cry while the world stole his father's dream. Silas pressed the pen to the paper. The shaking stopped. He began to write. To the honorable offices of Mitchell and Vance, Wichita, Kansas. I am writing to formally inquire regarding the precedents of contested guardianship and the Homestead Act of 1862 within your jurisdiction. Specifically, the matter of conflict of interest when a petitioner for guardianship holds an active property dispute against the estate of the minor in question. The words flowed. The legal terminology, buried for almost 2 decades, rushed back to him. He didn't write like a cowboy. He wrote like a scholar. He wrote like a captain. Silas filled 3 pages. His handwriting was sharp, elegant, and lethal. He folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, addressed it. He walked to the window, looked out at Dodge City. The saloons were still loud. Men were still drinking, gambling, shooting each other over bad cards. It was a wild, lawless place. But Silas Montgomery wasn't running anymore. He had drawn a line in the dirt. And Jetta Thorne was about to find out what happened when you crossed a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The coffee was black, bitter. It tasted like burnt earth and hard mornings. Silas drank it anyway. He sat at the long wooden table in the kitchen of Kensington's Rest. The sun wasn't fully up yet. The sky out the window was the color of bruised iron. Martha Kensington stood by the cast-iron stove. She wore a heavy canvas apron over her dress. She was turning thick slices of bacon in a hot skillet. The grease popped and hissed. It was just the 2 of them. The boarding house was quiet. Silas watched her. She was a woman who knew how to carry her own weight. She didn't ask for help. She didn't wait for permission. But Silas had learned a long time ago that nobody survived in this world entirely alone. Not without it costing them their soul. He set his coffee cup down. The ceramic clinked against the wood. "I need to ask you something, Mrs. Kensington." Martha didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the skillet. "If it's about the rent..." "Mr. Montgomery, you're paid up through Sunday. If it's about the coffee, I know it's strong. Deal with it. It's about Jedediah Thorne." The fork in Martha S. hand stopped moving, just for a second. The bacon hissed. She carefully moved the skillet off the direct heat. She wiped her hands on a rag. Then she turned around. She leaned against the wooden counter. She looked at Silas. Her eyes were sharp, cold. "What about him?" "I've been working his eastern ridge," Silas said. His voice was low. "Even, I found a boundary marker. Belongs to the boy, Caleb Wright, the one Thorne is trying to adopt." Martha didn't look surprised. She just looked tired. She let out a slow breath. "Nathaniel Wright's boy." "Thorne isn't looking for a son," Silas said. "He's looking for a deed. He's going to steal that land right out from under a 7-year-old orphan." Silas watched her face, waiting for the shock, waiting for the outrage. It didn't come. Martha walked over to the table. She pulled out a chair opposite him. She sat down. She folded her hands on the scarred wood. "I know exactly what Jedediah Thorne is capable of, Silas." It was the first time she used his first name. "I know how he operates. I know how he smiles while he cuts your throat." Silas leaned forward. "How do you know?" Martha looked out the window, at the bruised sky. "My late husband was William Kensington," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor of old anger beneath it. "He was a good man, hardworking, but he wasn't good with numbers. Before he died, we needed to fix the roof on this place. We needed lumber. William took a loan." She looked back at Silas. He took it from his cousin, a distant cousin, Jedediah Thorne. Silas didn't speak. He just let the words hang in the quiet kitchen. "William died 3 years ago," Martha continued. "The fever took him fast. We hadn't paid the loan back yet. The dirt on William's grave wasn't even settled before Jedediah came knocking on that front door. He wore his fine suit. He brought flowers. And he brought a ledger." She tapped her finger on the table, hard. "He told me it was too much for a widow to handle. He told me he'd forgive the debt if I just signed the boarding house over to him. Said he'd let me stay on as a maid, out of the goodness of his heart." Silas felt his jaw tighten. "What did you do?" "I told him to get off my porch," Martha said. "I sold William S. pocket watch. I sold my wedding ring. I worked 19 hours a day. I scrubbed floors for the saloons down on Front Street until my hands bled. I paid him every single cent, with interest. I shoved the coins across his polished mahogany desk, and I told him to never speak to me again. Silas looked at the woman across from him. He saw the iron in her spine. "You didn't tell me?" Silas said. "I didn't know you my history," Martha replied. "No, you didn't." Silas paused. "I'm going to stop him, Martha. I'm going to stop him from taking that boy's land." Martha studied him. "You know what that means? It means going against a man who owns half the judges in this county. He will destroy you, Silas. He will dig up every mistake you've ever made." "Let him dig," Silas said. Martha shook her head, but there was respect in her eyes now. She sat up straighter. She looked Silas dead in the eye. "Listen to me, Silas Montgomery," Martha said. Her voice rang clear and firm in the quiet room. "A human being is not a piece of property to be traded. A child is not a debt for a rich man to collect. A fair society cannot survive if good people stay quiet while a man with money chops the rights out of the weak. Equality doesn't mean anything if it only applies to men wearing expensive suits. If you are going to fight for that boy's rights, you are doing the work of God, and I will help you." Silas nodded. The alliance was forged, not with blood, but with shared outrage. That afternoon, Silas didn't go back to the Ridge. He quit Thorne's payroll, left a note at the ranch office. He walked to the children's home. He waited by the fence until Mrs. Porter let the kids out for afternoon air. Caleb walked straight over to the fence, the hammer swinging on his hip. "I quit Thorne," Silas said. Caleb looked up. "Does that mean we're fighting now?" "Yeah, it means we're fighting." Silas gestured down the street. "Mrs. Porter, I'm taking the boy for a walk." Agnes Porter looked like she wanted to argue, but she saw the look in Silas's eyes. She nodded. Silas walked Caleb down to the livery stable behind Kensington's Rest. It smelled of sweet hay, old leather, and horse sweat. Silas Roan Gelding was in the back stall, a big, nervous animal. "Come here," Silas said. Caleb stepped up to the wooden gate. The snorted, stomped a heavy hoof. Caleb took quick back. Fear flashed in the boy's eyes. "Don't run," Silas said quietly. "Never run from a frightened thing. It just makes them feel like the world is as dangerous as they think it is." Silas opened the stall door. He didn't pull the horse. He just stood there. "A lot of men think the only way to handle a horse is to break it," Silas said. He kept his voice steady, rhythmic. "They use whips, spurs, heavy bits. They think fear equals respect." Silas reached out. He placed his hand flat on the horse's neck. The animal shivered, then settled. Silas looked down at Caleb. "I want you to learn this right now, Caleb, and I want you to remember it when you grow up to be a man." Silas spoke clearly, making sure every word landed. True strength is not about domination. It is not about forcing someone smaller or weaker to do what you want. That is cowardice. True masculinity, true strength is about understanding. It is about offering safety. It is about protecting the things that cannot protect themselves. You build trust, not terror. That is how you lead a horse, and that is how you lead a good life. Caleb listened. He swallowed. "Put your hand out," Silas instructed. "Palm flat. Don't push. Just offer it." Caleb raised a small, trembling hand. He held it flat. The roan lowered its massive head. Hot breath blew across Caleb's palm. The horse nudged the boy's hand with a soft velvet nose. Caleb let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. A tiny, fragile smile broke across his face. "He's soft," Caleb whispered. "He is," Silas said, "because you gave him a choice, and he chose to trust you." They spent the next hour in the quiet barn, brushing the horse, cleaning the hooves. It was the most peace Silas had felt in 6 years. When the sun started to dip low, turning Kansas-Sky into a fire of orange and purple. They walked back to the kitchen at Kensington's Rest. Martha had stew waiting, beef and potatoes, thick gravy. The three of them sat around the table, the widow, the lone cowboy, and the orphan. None of them belonged to each other by blood. But as the oil lamp flickered, casting warm shadows against the walls, it felt like something solid was taking root in that room. They were preparing for a war. They just didn't know the enemy had already made his next move. The parlor of the Dodge City Children's Home smelled of soap and boiled cabbage. It was a bleak room, bare wooden floors, faded curtains. Jedediah Thorne sat in the only comfortable chair. He looked completely out of place. His suit was bristling. His gold pocket watch gleamed in the dull morning light. The smell of his expensive bay rum cologne fought a winning battle against the cabbage. Agnes Porter stood nervously by the door, wringing her hands. "I've brought a few things for the children, Mrs. Porter," Thorne said. He gestured to a large wooden crate on the table. Apples, fresh baked bread, peppermint sticks. "You are too kind, Mr. Thorne. Truly a blessing," Agnes murmured. "Nonsense. It's my civic duty." Thorne smiled. It was a practiced, perfect smile. It didn't touch the coldness in his eyes. "Now, if I could have a moment alone with young Caleb, I want to make sure the boy is comfortable with the arrangements." "Of course. I'll fetch him." A minute later, Caleb walked into the room. He didn't slouch. He stood straight. His hands hung loosely by his sides. The small iron hammer was on his belt. "Hello, Caleb," Thorne said. His voice dropped an octave, taking on a warm, fatherly tone. "Mr. Thorne," Caleb said politely. Thorne reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a beautifully carved wooden horse, painted with care. He held it out. "Saw this in a shop window in Kansas City last week. I thought of you." Caleb looked at the toy. Any other 7-year-old would have grabbed it. Caleb didn't move his hands. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need toys." Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then it returned, slightly tighter. He set the horse on the table. "You are a serious young man, Caleb. I respect that. Life has forced you to be serious. But that's going to change. I'm going to provide for you. A real room, good clothes, a fine school." Caleb stared at him. He remembered what his father told him. When a stranger offers you something for nothing, check your pockets. "Why?" Caleb asked. Thorne chuckled, a rich, throaty sound. "Because it is the right thing to do. Now, the judge is finalizing the adoption papers next week, but my lawyer needs a preliminary form filled out, just to show the county that you agree to come live with me, to show that I am acting on your behalf." Thorne pulled a single sheet of heavy paper from his inside pocket and a silver fountain pen. He laid them on the table next to the wooden horse. "Just a formality," Thorne said smoothly. "I just need you to put your name right there on the bottom line. Or an X will do if you haven't learned your letters." Caleb stepped up to the table. He looked down at the paper. To Thorne, it was a safe bet. Caleb was an orphan, the son of a poor blacksmith. He was wearing rags. Thorne assumed the boy was illiterate. Most kids his age in this town were. But Caleb wasn't most kids. As Caleb looked at the ink on the page, his mind drifted back a year ago. Sitting on the dirt floor of the smithy, the roar of the forge heating the air. His father, Nathaniel, wiping soot from his brow, drawing letters in the dust with a hot iron rod. A is for anvil, son. B is for bellows. Learn these. Learn the words. A man with words doesn't have to fight with his fists. Caleb brought his focus back to the paper. He didn't move his lips. He read the words silently in his head. Hereby consent to the complete transfer of legal guardianship and the subsequent transfer of all associated property, right, land claims, and inheritances to the aforementioned Jedediah Thorne. Caleb felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Silas was right. It wasn't about a home. It was about the land, his father's land. Caleb looked up. He kept his face completely blank. Well? Thorne asked gently. Just an X right there. Caleb put his hands behind his back. I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne, but I can't sign that. Thorne frowned. The fatherly warmth vanished instantly. It's just a piece of paper, boy. It means I can take care of you. My pa told me never to sign my name to something I don't understand. Caleb lied smoothly, and I'd like Mr. Silas to look at it first. Thorne stood up. He towered over the boy. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. Silas Montgomery is a drifter, Thorne said. His voice was no longer smooth. It was hard, like slate tea. He is a nobody. He has nothing to offer you. I am offering you a future. Do not test my patience, boy. Sign the paper. Caleb didn't flinch. He looked straight up into Thorne's angry eyes. No, sir. Thorne reached out. He grabbed Caleb by the upper arm. His grip was painfully tight. Listen to me, you little. Before Thorne could finish, Caleb drove the heel of his boot hard into Thorne's polished shin. Thorne gasped and let go. Caleb didn't wait. He spun around, bolted out the parlor door, past a shocked Agnes Porter in the hallway, and burst out the front door into the street. He ran. He ran past the general store, past the saloons, his small legs pumping, dust kicking up behind him. He didn't look back. He just knew he had to get to Kensington as rest. He burst through the back door of the boarding house kitchen like a cannonball. Silas and Martha were at the table. Silas stood up instantly, his hand dropping toward his hip out of instinct. Caleb was panting, sweating. He leaned against the doorframe, trying to catch his breath. He came, Caleb gasped out. Thorne came. He brought a paper. Silas crossed the room in 3 strides. He knelt down in front of the boy. Are you hurt? Did he touch you? Grabbed my arm, Caleb said, rubbing it. I kicked him. I ran. Martha brought a glass of water. Caleb drank it in 1 gulp. The paper, Silas said. Did you sign it? Caleb shook his head vigorously. No, I read it. Just like you said, it said transfer of property rights. Silas stared at him. You read it? You know how to read legal print? Pa taught me. Every night by the fire. Caleb looked up at Silas, his eyes wide. He's trying to take it, Mr. Silas. He tried to make me give it away. Silas stood up. He looked at Martha. Thorne is getting desperate, Silas said. He knows I'm sniffing around. He wanted to get the boy's signature on a waiver before the judge hears my petition. Martha locked the back door. She pulled the heavy curtains closed. The boy can't go back to the orphanage, Martha said firmly. Thorne has access there. He has money there. Caleb is staying here. Silas looked down at Caleb. The boy was trembling now. The adrenaline was wearing off. The reality of what he had just done, defying the most powerful man in town, was sinking in. Silas knelt down. He took Caleb by the shoulders, firm but gentle. Look at me, Caleb. Caleb met his eyes. I am going to tell you a truth right now, and it is the most important truth you will ever hear. Silas spoke with absolute conviction. He needed the boy to understand his own power. A man like Jedediah Thorne thinks he owns the world because he has money, Silas said clearly. But they can take your money. They can burn your house down. They can steal your land. But the letters your daddy taught you, the words you know how to read, nobody can ever take that away from you. Silas tapped Caleb's temple. Education is your shield, Caleb. It is the one thing a rich man can never steal from a poor man. Because you knew how to read, you saved your own life today. Your father gave you the ultimate weapon. Ignorance makes you a slave to men like Thorn. Knowledge makes you a free man. Do you understand? Caleb nodded. The trembling stopped. A fierce pride flared in his chest. His father hadn't left him nothing. His father had left him a shield. Yes, sir, I understand. Good. Silas stood up. Martha, where can he sleep? The storeroom, off the kitchen, Martha said immediately. There's no windows. It's safe. I'll make up a pallet with some quilts. That night, Caleb lay in the dark storeroom. It smelled of flour sacks and dried apples. It was a small space, but it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a fortress. Silas sat in a wooden chair right outside the storeroom door in the dark kitchen. Winchester rifle rested across his lap. He didn't sleep. He listened to the wind rattling the glass. Inside the room, Caleb reached down. His fingers traced the cold iron of the hammer beside him on the quilt. He closed his eyes. For the first time since his father died, Caleb Wright didn't feel alone in the dark. Morning came to Dodge City with a pale, cold light. Silas didn't wait for the sun to warm the streets. He had a job to do. He walked out of Kensington S. Rest. His boots crunched on the frost-hardened dirt. He went straight to the courthouse. The clerk behind the desk looked up. Same little man with the wire-rimmed glasses. He sighed when he saw Silas. What is it today? The clerk asked. I need to file a petition, Silas said. He slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. The clerk picked it up. He adjusted his glasses. He read it. Then he looked at Silas. A petition for guardianship for the right boy. The clerk let out a short, dry laugh. You're joking, right? Do I look like I'm joking? Mr. Montgomery, you are a drifter. You don't own property. You don't have a wife. You don't even have a steady wage. Jedediah Thorne is a man of means. A judge will look at this and throw it straight into the stove. File it, Silas said. It costs $2 to file. Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out two silver dollars. He set them gently on the wood. They rang with a dull, heavy sound. File it, Silas repeated. His voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. The clerk swallowed. He took the coins. He reached for his ink stamp. He brought it down on the paper with a loud thud. Silas took his receipt. He walked out. Step one was done. But the clerk was right. Silas needed more than a piece of paper. He needed to prove he had a connection to the boy. He needed a character, witness. Someone who knew Nathaniel Wright. Someone who could testify that Nathaniel wouldn't want a snake like Thorn raising his son. Silas walked down to the industrial end of town. He followed the sound of ringing iron. He found a blacksmith shop set back from the street, an open-air shed. The forge was roaring. A massive man with a gray beard and shoulders like boulders was hammering a red-hot horseshoe on an anvil. Silas waited. You don't interrupt a man working hot iron. The blacksmith finished. He dropped the shoe into a barrel water. Steam hissed and plumed into the cold air. The man wiped his face with a dirty rag. He looked at Silas. Need a horse shod? The man asked. No, Silas said. I need some information. Name's Silas Montgomery. Miller, the blacksmith grunted. What do you want to know? I'm looking for folks who knew Nathaniel Wright. Miller's expression softened. He tossed the rag onto a workbench. Nate? Yeah, I knew him. Shared this forge with him for 3 years before the fever took him. Good man, hard worker. Why are you asking? I'm trying to keep his boy out of Jedediah Thorne's hands. Miller let out a low whistle. That's a tall mountain to climb, friend, but God bless you for trying. Nate loved that boy fiercely. Taught him his letters right there in the dirt. Wanted him to be more than a man who swings a hammer. What kind of man was Nathaniel? Silas asked. I need things to tell the judge. I need to know where he came from. Miller leaned against the anvil. Came from Ohio, originally. Didn't talk much about the time before he came west, but he was an honest, never cheated a customer. He had a bad limp in his left leg, made it hard for him to stand at the forge for too long, but he never complained. Silas nodded. Farm injury? No, Miller said, the war. Silas froze. The cold morning air suddenly felt very still. He was in the war? Yeah, Union side, Miller said. Drafted out of Ohio. He was just a kid then. 19, he said. Silas felt a strange ringing in his ears. It wasn't the anvil. It was a sound from a long time ago. Where? Silas asked. His voice was suddenly hollow. Down south, Miller said, scratching his gray beard. Georgia, I think. A place called Chickamauga, September of '63. Silas stopped breathing. He said it was a slaughter, Miller continued, not noticing the blood draining from Silas's face. Said he got hit by shrapnel on the second night. Artillery shell blew a trench wide open, buried him in the mud. His chest was torn up bad. He laid there, bleeding out. Thought he was dead. Miller paused. He looked at the glowing coals in the forge. Nate said a sergeant found him. A big fella. Hauled him out of the burning mud. Carried him over his shoulder for half a mile to a field hospital while the cannons were still firing. Nate passed out. When he woke up, the sergeant was gone. Nate never got his name. But he told me once that every good thing he had in his life, his wife, his land, his little boy, he owed to that nameless sergeant. Silas didn't say a word. He couldn't. His mind ripped violently backward through time. 15 years ago. The smell of sulfur, the screaming horses, the smoke so thick you couldn't see the moon. Silas was 19 years old, a sergeant, because everyone older was already dead. He remembered the trench. He remembered the mud slick with blood. He remembered the boy, pale, shaking, a jagged piece of iron in his thigh. I ain't got nobody waiting for me, the boy had cried in the dark. You do now, Silas had yelled over the gunfire. Hold on. Silas had lifted him, his own muscles tearing, lungs burning. He had carried that boy through hell. He dropped him at the surgeon's tent. Silas went back to the fighting. He never saw the boy again. He assumed he died on the table. So many of them did. But he didn't die. He lived. He moved to Kansas. He became a blacksmith. He had a son named Caleb. He carved a hammer for him. Silas reached out. He gripped the wooden post of the shed. His knuckles were white. The world was spinning. You all right, Montgomery? Miller asked, looking concerned. You look like you've seen a ghost. I have, Silas whispered. Silas turned. He walked away from the forge. He didn't say goodbye. He walked through Dodge City like a man in a dream. He had spent the last 6 years thinking his life was over. He had spent 6 years thinking that the things he did didn't matter. That the world was just a cruel, random place that took what it wanted and left you with nothing. But the world wasn't random. He had saved a life in the dark, and 15 years later, the universe had placed that Memon son on a wooden step right in front of him, waiting. Silas walked back to Kensington's as rest. He went through the kitchen. Martha was kneading dough at the counter. She took one look at his face and stopped. Silas, what's wrong? Where is he? Silas asked. His voice was rough, grating. In the barn, Martha said. With the horse. Silas walked out the back door. He crossed the yard. He opened the heavy barn doors. It was quiet inside. The dust floated in the shafts of sunlight. Caleb was sitting on a bale of hay. He was holding a stiff brush, waiting for Silas to come, show him how to groom the roan. He looked up when the door opened. Silas walked over. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of the boy. Silas dropped heavily to his knees. Both of them this time. He sank into the loose straw. He didn't care about the dirt. He brought himself completely down to Caleb's level. He looked at the boy. He looked at the stubborn chin, the clear eyes. He saw the 19-year-old soldier in the mud. He saw the father who taught his son to read. "Mr. Silas?" Caleb asked. He gripped his hammer, unsure. "Are you mad?" "No," Silas said. He had to force the words past the heavy lump in his throat. "Not mad, Caleb." Silas reached out. He placed his large, calloused hands on Caleb's small shoulders. He gripped them gently. "I want you to listen to me," Silas said. He looked deep into the boy's eyes. "I need to teach you something, the most important lesson about how this world works." Caleb stayed perfectly still. He nodded. "People are going to tell you that this world is a cold place," Silas said, speaking clearly, making sure every single word was understood. "They will tell you that every man is an island, that you only have to look out for yourself. They will tell you that a good deed is just a moment in time, and then it disappears like smoke." Silas shook his head. "That is a lie, Caleb. The absolute opposite is true, and you need to learn it today. Our lives are tied together, every single one of us. Good deed is a seed you plant in the dark. You never know what it's going to grow into. We do not walk alone. We belong to each other. When you help a stranger, when you stand up for someone who is broken, you are taking responsibility for the future. You cannot turn your back on a person in pain, because that person might be the reason you find your own salvation years down the road. Our actions ripple through time. We owe each other our humanity." Caleb listened, his young brow furrowed as he took in the heavy words. "Why are you telling me this now?" Caleb asked softly. Silas took a deep, shuddering breath. "Because I knew your father." Caleb's eyes widened.
"You did? From the town?"
"No," Silas said, "from a long time ago, before you were born, in the war." Silas let go of Caleb's shoulders. He sat back on his heels. "There was a battle," Silas said. Voice was quiet. "A terrible one. It was raining. It was dark. I was a sergeant. I found a boy in a trench. He was hurt bad. His leg was torn up. He was 9 years old, and he was terrified." Caleb stared at him, not blinking. "I picked him up," Silas said. "I carried him out of the fire. I left him with the doctors. I never knew his name. I never knew if he lived or died. I spent 15 years thinking about the boys I couldn't save." Silas looked at the iron hammer on Caleb's belt. Then he looked back up at the boy's face. "I talked to a blacksmith today, a man named Miller. He told me about your pa. He told me how your pa got a bad limp, how a nameless sergeant pulled him out of the mud at Chickamauga." The barn was completely silent. The roan horse shifted in its stall. Caleb sat frozen on the hay bale. His mind, sharp and quick, put the pieces together. The math was simple, but the meaning was massive. "You," Caleb whispered. "Me," Silas said. A single tear broke loose. It cut a clean track through the dust on his scarred cheek. "He lived, Caleb. He lived, and he had you. I didn't know. I didn't know." Caleb looked at the big man kneeling in the dirt. He looked at the bayonet scar. He looked at the tears in the eyes of a man who never cried. "So you saved my pa," Caleb said. His voice trembled. "I just carried him," Silas said. "He did the living." Caleb swallowed hard. The defensive wall he had built around his heart, the wall that kept him from crying, the wall that kept everyone out, finally cracked. "That's why you stopped," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "That day on the steps, that's why you didn't walk away." "No," Silas said honestly. "I stopped because you looked just as lonely as I felt. But I stayed because God put you there so I could finish the job." Caleb didn't say another word. He slid off the hay bale. He took one step forward, and then he threw his arms around Silas's neck. He buried his face in the rough canvas of Silas' coat, and for the first time since his father died, Caleb Wright began to cry. Not a quiet whimper, but deep, heavy sobs that shook his entire small frame. He cried for his father. He cried for the fear. He cried because he finally had somewhere to put it down. Silas went rigid. For 6 years, his body had rejected the touch of another human being. For 6 years, contact only meant violence. It meant a fight. It meant blood. His hands hovered in the air, shaking. He closed his eyes. He thought of his wife. He thought of his daughter. He thought of the empty, howling void in his chest that he had tried to fill with whiskey and miles. Slowly, very slowly, lowered his arms. He wrapped them around the boy. He pulled him tight against his chest. He buried his face in Caleb's hair. "I've got you," Sis whispered fiercely into the quiet barn. "I've got you, son. You're safe." Silas Montgomery hugged the boy, and as he held on to the son of the man he had saved, he felt the heavy stone in his own chest finally crack wide open. The lone cowboy wasn't lone anymore. He had come back to life. Jedediah Thorne did not like losing. He didn't yell. He didn't break things. Men who broke things were men who couldn't control their own hands. Thorne controlled everything. He sized it by the wide glass window of his office. Looking down at the muddy streets of Dodge City, the door opened, heavy oak scraping over a thick rug. "You sent for me, Mr. Thorne." Thorne turned around. Deputy Marshal Arthur Vance stood in the doorway. He was 44. Looked 50. He wore a faded canvas coat. The tin star on his chest was scratched. He held his hat in his hands. Vance was a good lawman, or he used to be, before the winter of '76. That winter had frozen his cattle, starved his family. Desperation makes a man blind. Vance had walked into Thorne's office, asked for a loan to save his farm. Thorne had smiled. He had opened his safe. He had handed over $800. Vance had been paying it back ever since, but the interest never stopped growing. Now, Vance didn't just owe Thorne money. He owed him his badge. "Sit down, Arthur," Thorne said. Vance sat in the leather chair. It felt too soft, like a trap. Thorne walked over to his desk. He picked up a silver cigar cutter, snapped the end off a thick Havana. "We have a problem," Thorne said. "A drifter named Silas Montgomery. He has filed a petition for guardianship of the Wright boy." Vance frowned. "The orphan? Why would a drifter want a kid?" "I don't care why," Thorne said flatly. The polite mask was completely gone. His voice was cold. "I care that he is in my way. The judge reviews the case next week." Thorne lit his cigar. The smoke curled toward the ceiling. "I want you to find out who this Montgomery really is," Thorne ordered. "Telegraph the marshals in Texas. Check the Army records in Washington. Find his criminal history. Find a warrant. Find out who he shot, who he cheated, or who he left behind." Vance shifted in his chair. "What if he's clean?" Thorne blew out a stream of gray smoke. He looked at Vance with dead, empty eyes. "If he is clean, Arthur, you will make sure he isn't. Not by the time you hand that report to the judge. Do you understand?" Vance felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Planting evidence. Lying to a judge. It went against everything that Tin Star stood for. He thought about saying no. He opened his mouth. "How is your wife, Arthur?" Thorne asked softly. "And your boy? 8 years old now, isn't he? It would be a shame for them to lose that nice farm. A terrible shame to be put out on the street." Vance closed his mouth. He gripped the brim of his hat. His knuckles turned white. "I understand, Mr. Thorne." Vance stood up. He walked out of the office. The air in the hallway felt thick, hard to breathe. He walked down to the telegraph office. He sent the wires, Texas, Ohio, the Ward Department. Then he waited. It took 2 days for the answers to come back. Vance sat at his small, cluttered desk in the Marshal S office. The wood stove was burning, but he felt freezing cold. He looked at the yellow telegraph slips spread out before him. He read them again, hoping his eyes had made a mistake. They hadn't. Silas Montgomery. No criminal record. No warrants pending. Texas. Rangers confirm clean history. Union Army records confirm. Rank sergeant. Honorable discharge. Promoted for extraordinary valor at Chickamauga. Vance rubbed his eyes. He leaned back in his creaking wooden chair. The man wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a drifter looking for a scam. He was a hero, good man, with a spotless record. Vance stared at his tin badge resting on the desk. He thought about, don't ask cold eyes, he thought about his own son. If he gave this clean report to Thorne, Thorne would just hire a local drunk to start a fight with Silas, or slip stolen money into Silas's saddlebags. Thorne would ruin a good man, and Vance would be the one holding the shovel. Vance stood up. He pinned the badge to his chest. It felt heavier than it ever had. He walked out onto Front Street. It was mid-morning. The saloons were quiet. Wagons rolled past, kicking up dust. Vance saw Silas Montgomery. Silas was sitting on a wooden bench outside a small bakery. He had a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He was watching the street, his eyes scanning, alert, like a soldier on picket duty. Vance crossed the street. He walked up to the bench. Silas didn't jump. He didn't reach for his gun. He just looked up. Calm, steady. Marshal, Silas said. Mind if I sit? Vance asked. Silas gestured to the empty space on the bench. Vance sat down. He stretched his legs out. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at the horses tied to the hitching post across the street. You're making a lot of noise for a man who just rode into town, Vance said quietly. I didn't start the noise, Silas replied. He took a sip of his coffee. I'm just trying to finish it. Vance let out a slow breath. Jedediah Thorne is not a man you want to cross, Montgomery. He owns the land. He owns the bank. He owns the judge. Does he own you? Silas asked. Direct. No hesitation. Vance flinched, just a tiny muscle pulling tight in his jaw. He finally turned his head. He looked Silas in the eye. He saw the bayonet scar. He saw the absolute, unbending resolve in the man's face. He owns my debt, Vance said. His voice was low, almost a whisper. He asked me to dig into your past. He wanted a reason for the judge to deny your petition. Silas didn't react. He just held his coffee cup. And what did you find? Nothing, Vance said. You're cleaner than a church bell. A war hero. Are you going to tell him that? He told me that if you were clean, I needed to make you dirty, Vance admitted. The shame tasted like ash in his mouth. Silas set his coffee down. He looked at the lawman. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a man drowning in a shallow puddle. Why are you telling me this, Arthur? Silas asked. Vance looked down at his boots. Because I've got a son, and I'm starting to wonder how I'm going to look him in the eye if I help destroy a man who's just trying to save an orphan. Vance stood up. Watch your back, Montgomery, Vance said. If I don't give Thorne what he wants, he'll find someone who will. Keep the boy close. Keep your eyes open. Vance tipped his hat. He walked away. Shoulders slumped. A man carrying a weight he couldn't drop. Silas watched him go. He finished his coffee. It was cold. He walked back to Kensington Ents Rest. He went through the back alley, stepped into the kitchen. Martha was slicing potatoes. Caleb was sitting at the table. He was using a piece of charcoal to practice writing his letters on a scrap of brown paper. Caleb looked up. Did you find out anything, mister? Silas? Silas hung his hat on a peg by the door. He walked over to the table. He pulled out a chair and sat down facing the boy. I ran into the deputy marshal, Silas said. Arthur Vance. Is he a bad man? Caleb asked. His charcoal hovered over the paper. Does he work for Mr. Thorne? I looked at Caleb. He saw the black and white way a child views the world. Good guys and bad guys. heroes and villains. It was time to tear that down. It was time to teach him how the world actually worked. Silas leaned forward. He rested his forearms on the table. "Listen to me carefully, Caleb," Silas said. His voice commanded the room. Martha stopped slicing potatoes. She turned to listen. "You asked me if Marshall Vance is a bad man. I want you to learn something right now. Life is rarely that simple. People are complicated, and you cannot judge a person's character without understanding their circumstances." Silas pointed a finger, making sure Caleb was paying attention. "Sometimes men do bad things because poverty backs them into a corner. Arthur Vance owes money, a lot of it. If he doesn't do what Thorne says, his family loses their farm. His wife and his own little boy will be thrown out into the cold." Caleb's eyes widened. "So, he has to be bad?" "No," Silas corrected firmly. "He doesn't have to be. He is making a choice. It's the wrong choice. But I want you to understand why he's making it. Fear makes men do terrible things. Desperation makes a good man compromise his soul. Before you judge a man's whole life, before you call him evil, you have to look at the fear that is driving him. You have to look at the gun pointed at his head, even if you can't see it." Silas paused. He let the words sink in. "I am teaching you this," Silas continued, his voice softening just a fraction, "because true strength requires empathy. Empathy means understanding someone else's pain. If you only see people as monsters, you will spend your whole life fighting. But if you can see a frightened man behind a badge, you might just find a way to help him do the right thing." Caleb stared at the brown paper on the table. He looked at the letters he had drawn. "Mr. Thorne uses people's fear," Caleb said quietly. "Yes, he does," Silas said. "That is what makes Thorne dangerous. He doesn't hold the gun. He just builds the trap." "What do we do about Marshall Vance?" Caleb asked, looking back up at Silas. "We give him a chance," Silas said. "We show him there's a way out of the trap. A man can only live in the shadows for so long before he starts missing the light." Martha walked over. She placed a hand on Silas's shoulder, a rare physical gesture of support. "That was a good lesson, Silas," she said softly. "It's a hard one," Silas replied. He looked at the back door, checking the lock out of habit. "We need to be careful," Silas told them both. "Thorne knows I'm not backing down. He's going to stop playing games. From now on, Caleb doesn't leave this house. Not even to the barn, unless I am with him. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said. He touched the hammer on his belt. The iron was cold, but it felt solid, real. Silas stood up. He walked into the parlor. He took his Winchester rifle off the hook. He checked the action. The metal slid with a smooth, deadly click. He slid a brass cartridge into the chamber. He didn't want to pull it. He had spent years trying to wash the blood off his hands. But as he looked back toward the kitchen, toward the widow who had taken them in, and the boy who had a dead man's eyes, Silas knew one thing for sure. Some things were worth bleeding for. He sat down in the chair by the front window, the rifle across his knees. He watched the street. The shadows were getting longer, creeping across the dirt, reaching toward the boarding house. Silas didn't blink. He waited for the dark. The courthouse was built of red brick, solid, heavy. Inside, it smelled of stale tobacco, floor wax, and old paper. Kind of smell that made a man want to whisper. The preliminary hearing wasn't in a courtroom. It was in the judge's private chambers, a small room cramped. Books stacked high on a dark oak desk. Judge Henry Aldrich sat behind the desk. He was a man of 60, gray hair thinning on top, eyes like chips of flint. He was a Kansas man, hard, pragmatic. He didn't suffer fools. Silas stood on one side of the room. He wore his only clean shirt. His boots were brushed, but they were still scarred leather. He held his hat in his hands. Jedidiah Thorne sat in a leather chair on the other side. He wore a charcoal suit, a gold watch chain draped across his vest. He looked like a man who owned the building. Next to Thorne sat his lawyer, Crawford Mitchell, a slick man from Wichita, hair oiled flat. "Let's get to it," Judge Aldrich grunted. He picked up the two files. "I have two petitions for the guardianship of the minor, Caleb Wright. One from Mr. Thorne, one from Mr. Montgomery." Aldrich looked at Silas. "Mr. Montgomery, you are a single man. You have no permanent residence. You list your occupation as a cattle drover. Can you tell me how, exactly, you plan to provide a stable home for a 7-year-old child?" Crawford Mitchell didn't wait for Silas to answer. He stood up. He smiled, a thin, greasy smile. "If it please the court," Mitchell said smoothly, "Mr. Montgomery is a drifter. He rents a room by the week. He has known this boy for less than a month. To grant him custody would be a gross negligence of the state S duty. Mr. Thorne, on the other hand, is a pillar of Dodge City. He has a vast estate. He can provide the boy with schooling, proper clothing, and a future." Thorne nodded, playing the humble benefactor. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," the judge said. He looked back at Silas. "Your turn, Mr. Montgomery. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't throw your petition in the stove right now." Silas didn't shift his feet. He didn't raise his voice. He looked the judge dead in the eye because, Your Honor, Mr. Thorne's petition is a fraud. It should be dismissed immediately on the grounds of a direct conflict of interest. The room went dead silent. Mitchell let out a short, mocking laugh. Conflict of interest? What would a trail cowboy know about the law? Silas ignored the lawyer. He kept his eyes on the judge. "Your Honor?" Silas said, his voice ringing clear and steady in the small room. The late Nathaniel Wright filed a homestead claim for 160 acres. The Jedediah Thorne Land Company filed a dispute against that exact claim 3 months ago. If Mr. Thorne is granted guardianship of the boy, he gains de facto legal control over the boy's inherited property, a property he is actively trying to acquire. Silas reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded paper, the stamped copy from the county clerk. He laid it on the judge's desk. "A guardian cannot serve two masters," Silas stated. "He cannot protect the financial interests of a child while simultaneously attempting to seize those same interests for his own company." Judge Aldrich picked up the paper. He read it. His flinty eyes narrowed. He looked over the paper at Thorne. Thorne's smile was gone. His face was a mask of cold fury. Mitchell stammered. "Your Honor, my client's business dealings are entirely separate from his charitable intentions toward the boy." "Quiet, Mitchell," the judge snapped. Aldrich looked back at Silas. He leaned back in his chair. He studied the big man with the bayonet scar. "You use your words like a man who knows how to weigh them," Aldrich said slowly. "Where did you study law, Mr. Montgomery?" Mitchell scoffed. "He's a cowpoke, Your Honor." "University of Cincinnati," Silas said quietly. 1858 to 1859. One year before the war called me away. The silence in the room returned. Heavier this time. Mitchell sank slowly back into his chair. Thorne stared at Silas, really looked at him for the first time. Not as a nuisance, but as a threat. "I am asking for a formal hearing, Your Honor," Silas said. "Give me 2 weeks to establish residency. I will present a proper case then." Aldrich tapped his fingers on the desk. He looked at the paperwork. He looked at Thorne. "Extension granted," Aldrich said. He banged a small wooden gavel. "Formal hearing is set for 1 week from today. Have your affairs in order, Mr. Montgomery." Dismissed. Silas turned and walked out. He didn't wait to see Thorne's face. He didn't need to. He walked out into the bright Kansas sun. He took a deep breath. The air tasted like dust and freedom. He had bought them a week. It wasn't much, but it was a fighting chance. Silas walked back to Kensington S. Rest. He found Caleb in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a charcoal stick. Martha was out back, hanging laundry on the line. Caleb looked up. His eyes were wide, hopeful, scared. "What happened?" the boy asked. Silas pulled up a chair. He sat down. He put his hat on the table. "We got a week," Silas said. "The judge granted a formal trial. We fight it out in the courtroom." Caleb let out a breath. "Did you tell the judge about the land?" "I did," Silas said. "I told him it was a conflict of interest." "What does that mean?" Silas leaned in. This was important. He wanted the boy to understand the weapons they were using. "I want you to learn this, Caleb," Silas said. His voice was firm, instructive. "The law isn't just a set of rules to punish folks. It's a set of rules we all agreed on to keep the strong from eating the weak. When a man has a financial interest in a child's property, he cannot be that child's guardian. That is called a conflict of interest. It means a man cannot serve two masters when one of them is his own wallet." Caleb nodded slowly, tracing the edge of the paper with his charcoal. "Mr. Thorne wants to serve his wallet," Caleb said. "Exactly," Silas said. "The law demands fairness. If the judge lets Thorne adopt you, the judge is basically handing Thorne a license to rob you. And the law, when it works right, doesn't give out licenses to steal. It protects the person who can't protect themselves. But Mr. Thorne is rich," Caleb said softly. "Doesn't he make the rules?" "He tries to," Silas said. "But words have weight, Caleb. The law is written down. Once it's on paper, it applies to the man in the mansion just the same as the man in the dirt. You just have to be brave enough to read it out loud to them." Caleb looked at Silas. "You read it out loud today." "I did." "Where did you learn to do that?" Silas looked at his hands. "The rough, callous skin. Before the war," Silas said. "I went to a school for it. I was going to be a lawyer." Caleb's eyes widened. "Why didn't you?" "The war started. I went to fight. After the war, I was tired, Caleb. I was so tired. I didn't want to argue anymore. Just wanted quiet. So I let that part of me go." Caleb reached out. His small hand touched Silas' thick wrist. "I'm glad you brought it back," Caleb said. Silas felt a hard lump form in his throat. He looked at the boy. He saw Nathaniel Wright's eyes. "Me too, son," Silas whispered. "Me too." The sun went down. The boarding house grew quiet. Silas was out in the barn, brushing the roan, thinking about the week ahead, thinking about how he was going to establish a permanent residence with no money to buy a house. Inside the kitchen, the oil lamp flickered. Martha was wiping down the counter. Her back was to the door. The heavy front door of the boarding house opened. The bell jingled. Martha wiped her hands on her apron. She walked out of the kitchen and into the parlor. Jedediah Thorne was standing in the entryway. He didn't look angry. He looked perfectly calm. That was what made him dangerous. He smelled of that heavy, sweet bay rum. "Good evening, Martha," Thorne said. Martha stopped. She didn't offer him a seat. She didn't smile. "What do you want, Jedediah?" Thorne took his hat off. He stepped further into the room. He looked around, running a finger over the back of a wooden chair. Checking for dust. He didn't find any. "You keep a nice place here, Martha. It would be a tragedy to lose it." Martha crossed her arms. "I paid you, Jedediah, every cent. 3 years ago. You have no claim on this house." Thorne smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Records can be complicated things, Martha. Sometimes interest miscalculates. Sometimes a clerk finds an unpaid fee. A technicality. It wouldn't take much for my lawyers to tie this property up in court for years. You'd be ruined before the first hearing." Martha stood her ground. Her heart was beating fast, but her face was stone. "Why are you here?" she asked again. "I want Silas Montgomery out of my town," Thorne said. The polite tone finally cracked. The demand bled through. "I want you to throw him out tonight. Lock your doors. And when the trial happens next week, I want you to testify that he is an unstable, violent drunk. If you do that, your boarding house stays yours. Forever. Consider it family charity." Martha looked at the man. She saw the expensive suit, the gold watch, the absolute rot underneath it all. She took a slow, deep breath. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake. It rang with the kind of clarity that only comes from deep, unbending conviction. "You listen to me, Jedediah," Martha said. She stepped toward him, pointing a finger at his chest. "I want you to hear this clearly, because nobody in your life has ever had the spine to say it to you." Thorne frowned, caught off guard by her advance. "A woman's livelihood is not a bargaining chip," Martha stated, her words sharp and rhythmic. "My dignity and that boy's future do not have a price tag. You think money buys you the right to treat people like property. It doesn't." She stepped closer, unafraid. "Human rights are not bought and sold, Jedediah. They belong to us because we draw breath. The right for a child to keep what his father left him. The right for a woman to own her labor. You are trying to buy my conscience. But my conscience is not for sale, not for a boarding house, not for all the land in Kansas." Thorne's face flushed red. "You are making a terrible mistake, Martha. You're throwing away your life for a stray cowboy and an orphan." "I am standing up for equality," Martha fired back. "Because if I let crutch of them today, you'll feel justified in crushing someone else tomorrow. Equality before the law means you don't get to buy your way out of the truth. Now, get out of my house." Thorne stared at her. He breathed heavily through his nose. He put his hat back on. "You will regret this," Thorne promised softly. "The only thing I regret," Martha said, "is that William ever shared a name with you." Thorne turned. He walked out the door. He slammed it shut behind him. The glass in the windows rattled. Martha stood in the empty parlor. Her hands began to shake. The adrenaline was crashing. She grabbed the back of the wooden chair to steady herself. She had just declared war on the richest man in the county. She could lose everything. The house, the business, her independence. A floorboard creaked in the shadows near the hallway. Martha spun around. Silas stepped out of the dark. He held his Winchester rifle in his right hand. The barrel pointed down. He had come in through the back door when he heard the bell ring. He had heard the whole thing. Martha let out a breath. "How long were you standing there?" "Long enough," Silas said softly. He walked over to her. He looked at her trembling hands. He didn't offer empty comforts. He didn't tell her it was going to be all right. He gave her the only thing that mattered: respect. "You didn't have to do that," Silas said. "He'll come after you now." Martha looked up at him. Her eyes were fierce, even through the fear. "I know," she said. "But what good is having a voice if you only use it when it's safe?" Silas looked at the widow. He had faced Confederate charges. He had stood in trenches while artillery rained down. He knew what bravery looked like. It didn't always carry a gun. Sometimes it wore a canvas apron and smelled like baking bread. "Thank you, Martha," Silas said. "Don't thank me yet," she replied, straightening her back. "We still have a trial to win, and you still don't have a house." Silas nodded. He looked toward the back of the house where Caleb was sleeping in the storeroom. "I'll figure it out," Silas said. "I'm not letting him go." Martha smiled, a small, real smile. "I know you aren't, Silas. Now go make sure that door is locked. We're going to need our sleep." Silas locked the heavy door. He slid the deadbolt home with a loud, metallic clack. It was the sound of a line being drawn. The weight of words had been spoken. Now, they just had to survive the consequences. The clock ticked. It was a heavy, brass thing on the kitchen wall. Every second felt like a hammer striking an anvil. It was past midnight. The boarding house was dead quiet. Silas sat at the long wooden table. The oil lamp burned low. It cast long, dancing shadows against the walls. The table was covered in papers, notes, legal precedents he had scratched out from memory. He rubbed his eyes. They burned. He had the law on his side regarding Thorne's conflict of interest. He knew that. But the judge was a practical man. The law also stated a guardian needed a stable home, a permanent residence. Silas didn't have one. He had a rented room and a horse. Thorne had a mansion. Thorne had money. In a courtroom, money usually talked louder than the truth. Silas leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked. He looked toward the storeroom door. Caleb was in there, sleeping, trusting him. Silas felt a heavy ache in his chest, a good ache, but a terrifying one. A floorboard groaned. Silas didn't jump. His hand just naturally slid toward the Colt on his hip. He waited. The sound came from the back porch, outside the kitchen door. Someone was standing out there in the dark. Silas stood up. He moved silently across the kitchen. He didn't unholster the gun, but his hand rested on the grip. He stood by the door. 3 soft knocks, deliberate, not a drunk, not a thief. Silas slid the deadbolt back. He opened the door an inch. The cool night air slipped in. Deputy Marshal Arthur Vance stood on the porch. He wasn't wearing his tin star. He wore a heavy wool coat. His hat was pulled low. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had been walking a long road and finally reached the end of it. "Let me in, Silas," Vance whispered. Silas opened the door. Vance stepped inside. Silas locked it behind him. Vance didn't sit down. He stood by the table. He looked at the scattered legal notes. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a thick stack of yellow paper. Telegraph slips, folded and bound with a piece of twine. He tossed them onto the table. They landed with a soft slap. "What is this?" Silas asked. "Proof," Vance said. His voice was ragged. "Telegrams. Between Thorne and his lawyers back east. Dating back to December. 3 months before Nathaniel Wright died." Silas stared at the yellow papers. He didn't touch them yet. "Thorne knew Nathaniel was sick," Vance explained. He wouldn't look at Silas. He looked at the floor. He was planning the land dispute while the man was still breathing. He hired men to track the boy's status. He instructed his lawyers to draft the guardianship papers the day after Nathaniel was buried. It's all there in ink. It proves his only interest in the boy is the land. Silas slowly reached out. He untied the twine. He unfolded the top slip. He read the harsh, clipped words of the telegraph. It was damning. It was the silver bullet. Silas looked up at the lawman. "Where did you get these, Arthur?" "Thorne keeps copies of everything," Vance said. "He's arrogant. Thinks nobody would ever dare look. I have keys to his office. Have for 2 years. For security." Silas set the paper down. He looked at Vance. He saw the tremble in the man's hands. "If I show these to the tomorrow," Silas said slowly, "Thorne will know it was you. You re the only one with the keys. He will call in your debt. He will take your farm. Your family will be out on the street." "I know," Vance said. "Then why are you doing this?" Vance finally looked up. He met Silas's eyes. The lawman's face was pale, but his jaw was set tight. The fear was gone, replaced by a hard, unyielding resolve. "I went to the children's home today," Vance said. His voice grew steady. "I went to see the boy, to see the face of the kid I was helping to ruin. I stood by the fence. I watched him. He wasn't playing. He was sitting in the dirt with 2 younger orphans, 5-year-olds. He had a stick. He was teaching them how to draw the alphabet in the dust. Vance swallowed hard. I have an 8-year-old boy at home, Vance continued. I have spent the last 2 years telling myself that I was obeying Thorn to protect my son. I told myself that keeping a roof over his head was the only thing that mattered. But I was lying to myself. Vance stepped closer to the table. He pointed at the telegrams. I want you to listen to me, Silas, Vance said. The words carried a heavy, explicit truth. I want you to tell that boy in the other room what I am about to say. A father's first job is not to provide comfort. A father's job is to provide a moral compass. If I teach my son that it is acceptable to look away while a rich man crushes a poor boy just to save our own skins, then I have failed as a man. I have failed as a father. Silas listened. He felt a deep respect rise in his chest. True bravery is not about holding a gun, Vance stated clearly, his voice ringing with conviction in the quiet kitchen. It is not about a tin badge. True bravery is sacrificing your own security to make sure justice is done for someone else. It is doing the right thing when the right thing costs you everything you have. I will not raise my son to be a coward. I will lose that farm with my head held high, and my son will know his father was an honest man. The kitchen was silent. The brass clock ticked. Silas reached across the table. He gripped Vance's hand. It was a firm, hard handshake between two men who understood the weight of the world. You are a good man, Arthur, Silas said. I'm trying to be, Vance replied. He pulled his hand back. He adjusted his hat. Give him hell tomorrow, Silas. I will. Vance turned. He walked out the back door, slipping away into the Kansas night. Silas stood by the table. He looked at the telegrams. The game had changed. The shadows were breaking. The storeroom door creaked open. Silas turned. Caleb was standing in the doorway. He was wearing his oversized shirt. He rubbed his sleepy eyes. The iron hammer hung on his belt. He had slept in... Mr. Silas, Caleb mumbled. Who was that? Silas walked over. He knelt down in front of the boy. That was a brave man, Caleb, Silas said softly. That was a man who just gave up everything he owns to make sure we get to keep what's yours. Caleb looked confused. Why would he do that? Because he finally remembered what a man is made of. Silas put a hand on Caleb's shoulder. Go back to sleep, son. We have a big day tomorrow. We are going to court. Are we going to win? Caleb asked. Silas looked at the yellow papers on the table. He thought about Martha. He thought about Vance. He thought about the dead blacksmith who had taught this boy to read. Yes, Silas said. We are going to win. The courtroom was packed. It was a hot May morning. The air in the room was stifling. Smelled of sweat, cheap wool, and nervous tension. Word had spread through Dodge City. The lone cowboy and the widow fighting, the richest man in the county over an orphan boy. Half the town was there to watch the blood spill. Judge Aldrich sat high on his wooden bench. He looked down at the room. He banged his gavel. The sharp crack echoed off the brick walls. The murmuring crowd went dead silent. Court is in session, the bailiff called out. Silas sat at a small wooden table on the left. Caleb sat beside him. The boy was wearing a clean shirt Martha had bought him. His hair was combed. He sat perfectly straight. The hammer was on his hip. Martha sat in the front row right behind them. Jedediah Thorne sat at the table on the right. His lawyer, Crawford Mitchell, was standing, smiling, looking completely relaxed. Let us begin, Judge Aldrich said. Mr. Mitchell, you represent Mr. Thorne's petition. Proceed. Mitch walked to the center of the floor. He hooked his thumbs into his vest pockets. Your Honor. Members of the gallery, Mitchell began. His voice was loud, theatrical. We are here today regarding a tragedy, a poor, destitute orphan. A boy who has lost everything. He is a ward of the state. A burden on the taxpayers. He has no family. He has no guidance. He is a street urchin, practically. Caleb flinched. He stared at the floor. Silas put a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. My client, the Honorable Jedediah Thorne, wishes to save this boy, Mitchell continued. He offers a mansion, tutors, wealth. Now, let us look at the opposing petition. Mr. Silas Montgomery. Mitchell spun around. He pointed an accusing finger at Silas. Adrift, a man with no home, no property, no wife. He lives in a rented room. The law clearly states a guardian must provide a stable environment. Mr. Montgomery cannot even provide a roof of his own. To give this boy to a wandering cowhand would be a travesty of justice. Mitchell walked back to his table. He sat down, smug. Judge Aldrich looked at Silas. Mr. Montgomery, your rebuttal. Silas stood up. He picked up the stack of yellow telegrams. He walked to the judge's bench. He handed them up to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. Your Honor, Silas said, his voice calm, cutting through the hot air like a knife. Those are copies of telegraphs sent between Mr. Thorne and his legal counsel. They date back to 3 months before the boy's father died. They explicitly discuss a strategy to acquire the right land claim by exploiting the boy's impending orphanhood. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Thorne's face turned the color of chalk. Mitchell jumped up. Objection, these are stolen documents. They are inadmissible, Mitchell shouted. They are the truth, Silas fired back. Aldrich slammed his gavel. Order! Sit down, Mr. Mitchell. I will review these documents. The judge put on his reading glasses. He read the telegrams. The silence in the room was suffocating. Aldrich's face darkened. He looked over his glasses at Thorne with absolute disgust. These are disturbing, Mr. Thorne. Very disturbing, Aldrich said. But the judge looked back at Silas. Mr. Mitchell is correct on one point of law. You do not have a permanent residence, Mr. Montgomery. The law requires a stable home for the child. That is the letter of the law. Mitchell smiled again. Exactly, Your Honor. The cowboy has no home. The boy belongs in a proper institution until a suitable, wealthy family can be found. He is just an orphan. He doesn't know what is good for him. Mitchell looked directly at Caleb. He sneered. He is a child with nothing and no one. He is entirely alone. That was it. That was the breaking point. Caleb had held it together through the bullying, through the grief, through the terrifying men in suits. But hearing this man tell a room full of people that he was nothing, that he had nobody. Caleb jumped up from his chair. The chair clattered to the floor. The boy was shaking. Tears streamed down his face. The stoic mask was gone. He was just a 7-year-old boy whose heart was broken. Stop it, Caleb screamed at the lawyer. His voice cracked, echoing off the high ceiling. You're trying to take my pa's land. You're trying to take everything. Caleb looked wildly around the room, at the judge, at the crowd. They're taking everything, Caleb cried out, his voice raw with pure, unfiltered agony. Because I don't have a father. The courtroom froze. The raw pain in the boy's voice hit every single person in the chest. Silas Montgomery didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of the boy. He ignored the judge. He ignored the lawyer. Silas dropped to one knee on the hard wooden floor. He brought himself down to Caleb's level. He reached out with both hands and grabbed the boy's shaking shoulders. He gripped them tight, anchoring the boy to the earth. Silas looked him dead in the eye. His own eyes burned with a fierce, absolute fire. Not anymore, Silas said. His voice wasn't a whisper. It was a vow. It carried to the back of the room. You're mine, Caleb gasped. He stared at the big man kneeling in front of him. Silas stood up. He didn't let go of Caleb's hand. He turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," Silas said. His voice commanded the room. Everyone listened. "Mr. Mitchell says this boy has no family. He says, I am just a drifter. I want this court to hear the truth about what a family is, and I want it on the official record." Silas spoke clearly, every word measured and heavy. "A family is not defined by the blood in your veins. Blood is just an accident of birth. It guarantees nothing. A true family is built on a choice. It is the conscious, daily decision to stand by someone when the world goes dark. It is the unbreakable commitment to protect a child's rights, to respect his dignity, and to love him without conditions." Silas pointed to the telegrams on the judge's desk. "Mr. Thorne has money, but he looks at this boy and sees a deed to a farm. I look at this boy and I see my son. I choose this boy, and he chooses me. That choice makes us a family. And if the law of Kansas cannot recognize that love and duty carry more weight than a rich man's bank account, then the law is broken." Silas finished. He stood tall, holding the boy's hand. The courtroom was dead silent. In the front row, Martha wiped a tear from her cheek. Judge Aldrich looked at Silas. He looked at Caleb. Then he took off his glasses. "Mr. Montgomery is right," Aldrich said. His voice was firm. "The letter of the law requires a residence, but the spirit of the law requires protection, equality, and care. The law was not created to help predators wear sheep's clothing. It was created to defend the vulnerable." Aldrich picked up his gavel. "In the matter of Caleb Wright, I find the petition of Jedediah Thorne to be fraudulent and dismiss it entirely. I hereby grant full legal custody and guardianship to Silas Montgomery, on the condition that a permanent residence is established within 60 days. Court is adjourned." The gavel slammed down. The crowd erupted in cheers. Thorne stood up, his face twisted in fury. He shoved past his lawyer and stormed out the back doors. Silas looked down. Caleb was looking up at him. The boy wasn't crying from fear anymore. "Did we win?" Caleb whispered. "We won, son," Silas said. "We're going home." 3 months later, August on the Kansas prairie. The grass was tall and green. The creek ran clear, Jed. Dia Thorne was gone. He had quietly packed his bags and taken a train east after the town turned its back on him. Arthur Vance had lost his farm to the bank, but the people of Dodge City, led by Martha Kensington, had raised enough money to lease it back for him. He still wore the badge, and he wore it with pride. Out by the creek, on the 160 acres that belonged to Caleb Wright, a new cabin stood. It was small, built of raw pine and hard work, but it had a real glass window. Silas sat on the front porch. The sun was going down. The sky was bleeding gold and purple. Caleb was out in the dirt yard. He was brushing the roan horse. He was talking to the animal, soft and calm. The hammer still hung on his belt, but the heavy, old look in his eyes was gone. He was just a boy. Silas held a piece of paper on his knee. He had a pencil in his hand. He was writing a letter to his old Army commander back in Ohio. "I finally stopped running, Captain. I found a place to stand. It wasn't what I expected. It was a 7-year-old boy sitting on a step." Silas paused. He looked out at the boy. "I told you once that the grief I carried was a heavy stone. I thought it would crush me. I was wrong. The stone hasn't gone away. It never will. But it is lighter now, because I am not carrying it alone." Silas signed his name. He folded the paper. He leaned back in his chair. He watched his son groom the horse. The lone cowboy closed his eyes. The wind blew across the prairie. It didn't sound like a hollow howl anymore. It sounded like peace. Some characters in this story may display flawed judgment, emotional instability, or morally questionable choices as part of their personal journeys. These portrayals are intended to explore human emotion and conflict within a fictional context and should not be interpreted as guidance or endorsement. If this story gave you something to think about, please like, comment, share it with others, and subscribe to follow more meaningful Western tales.
In the end, this story is not only about a cowboy, an orphan boy, or a piece of land on the Kansas frontier. It is about the quiet choices that reveal who we truly are when no one is watching. Silas Montgomery rode into Dodge City as a broken man, carrying grief, war, and loss like stones in his chest. Caleb Wright sat on those orphanage steps believing the world had forgotten him. Yet when their paths crossed, both of them discovered that even the loneliest souls can become a home for each other. Silas taught Caleb that a person's worth is not decided by money, bloodline, power, or the cruelty of those who try to take advantage of the weak. Caleb taught Silas that love does not die with the people we lose. Sometimes it returns in a different face, asking us to be brave one more time. The meaning of this story lies in its reminder that true strength is not found in domination, violence, or pride. True strength is found in protection, honesty, patience, and compassion. A real man is not the one who can frighten others into obedience, but the one who can kneel down to a frightened child and make him feel seen. A just society is not built by powerful men who bend the law for their own gain, but by ordinary people who refuse to stay silent when someone helpless is being robbed of their future. Silas could have walked away. Martha could have protected only herself. Caleb could have surrendered to fear, but each of them chose courage. And because of that, a boy's inheritance, dignity, and hope were saved. This story also teaches us the value of education and truth. Caleb's father left him more than a hammer and a memory. He left him the ability to read, to understand, and to protect himself from men who believed a poor orphan would never know his rights. Knowledge became Caleb's shield. Truth became Silas's weapon. And justice became possible because someone had the courage to speak clearly in a room where powerful men expected silence. Most of all, this tale reminds us that kindness never disappears. A good deed may seem small in the moment, like carrying a wounded soldier from the mud or offering bread to a hungry boy. But mercy has a way of traveling through time. It plants seeds in places we may never see, until one day those seeds grow into redemption, family, and healing. Silas once saved Caleb's father without knowing his name. Years later, he was given the chance to save that man's son, and in doing so, he saved himself. So as we leave this dusty road behind, let us remember that every human being deserves dignity, every child deserves protection, and every wounded heart deserves a chance to love again. In a harsh world, compassion is not weakness. It is the bravest thing we can offer. And sometimes, the family we are searching for is not the one we were born into, but the one we choose to stand beside when the storm comes.